I said I feel invincible.
Good day, YouTube. It is I, once more. I come here once again, but this time for a slightly different reason, with a slightly different video format. This is far more a reaction rather than a pre-scripted video. Therefore my responses will be a tad bit more genuine, as well as spontaneous. Now anyhow, along with the usual drivel that the BBC releases, they also happen to release a bit of politically charged drivel, the sole purpose of which is to impugn upon the Europeans. That likewise includes the entire Anglosphere, and is solely contrived just to push a message. That being, not to use a trite convention, but the woke agenda, so to say. Now anyhow, this is the article by the BBC, released a mere 7 hours ago as of recording, on the 16th of August 2026. Herein it is titled, "Ghana was the crime scene, the country leading the demand for slavery reparations." So this ought to be interesting. I can tell it's going to be laced with hypocrisy. Captives were held in Ghana's Cape Coast Castle. Okay, we got a generic picture of the castle. Cool, I guess. Okay, holding cell. This year has seen a dramatic change in tone in the global conversation about the transatlantic slave trade. The demand for formal apologies, debt relief, and financial compensation from nations and institutions that benefited from slavery has become increasingly forceful. This is a great irony, purely predicated upon the fact that these countries themselves were the ones who sold their brethren into slavery. I find it greatly humorous that they are now trying to scrimp off the Europeans and pilfer what little they have left, despite their current indigence.
Oh my God, bro.
Oh, hell no, man. What the hell? Oh my God.
Maybe if these countries spent more energy on ameliorating themselves, they might not be in this predicament. That is not to say that the people within these countries are indolent by any means, but rather their governments are inept, much like the Western ones. In March, a resolution was passed at the United Nations recognizing slavery as the greatest crime against humanity, though the United States voted against the resolution, and every European nation abstained from the vote. Now, I personally think that the United States should not have voted against the resolution, nor should the EU have. However, I believe, unfortunately, that their hand was swayed by the fact that if they did recognize this resolution, they would have what little they have left pilfered by the majority. Interestingly enough, this scenario somewhat appears within the book Democracy, the God That Failed by Hans Hermann Hoppe, where he makes a remark upon the farcical nature of democracy by using a very similar scenario to this, wherein it were India and China voting together to pilfer the wealth of the West. Now, whilst the West doesn't really have all too much wealth as of current, China being leagues ahead of the West in terms of technology at the very least, we still hold a great deal of GDP. At least that is for the rest of the Anglosphere and Germany in regards to Europe, that is. Britain itself is rather an indigent country. Their penurious state to be ascribed to socialism as well as wokeism. However, that is not the matter here. The UK, which alongside Portugal dominated the transatlantic slave trade, has consistently rejected the idea of paying reparations, which is perhaps unsurprising, given estimates of what Britain owes in damages to nations affected run into many trillions of pounds. I'm sorry, was the... I'm sorry, was having your freedom bought back not sufficient? Likewise, it mentions nations. The issue with nation is that whilst definitions vary, for example, you have the definition of nation as in a country, and then definition of nation as in the race. The thing is, by nations, I'm going to presume that this happens to pertain to the idea of the state. Now, the issue is, these states did not even exist hitherto Europeans arriving and reorganizing their tribal structures into modern state structures. Hence, this is a completely fallacious interpretation, because there was no victim here in regards to country-wise. On the individual level, yes, there were victims. However, by no means was a country a victim, nor can it truly be. The one exception I shall remark upon is that of Algeria, in which case the French, upon leaving, utilised chemical weapons in an attempt to maintain their colony. Now that should require reparation, because that is a direct war crime. Notwithstanding that, they should not have to pay for the act of colonisation on its own, for else we'd be having to trace ourselves back hundreds of years, because even the French could claim from the Middle East reparations for the expanse of the caliphate into their lands in the south, back when the Franks were just organising their state, and Spain had been colonised by the Arabs. So really, this would be quite deleterious to them, in fact, because not only in history have they colonised the West in a way, at least the Northern Africans, but in addition to that, they have colonised one another, with many of these states invading one another and taking chunks of land and whatnot. Additionally, it's worth mentioning that if this just pertains to the slave trade, rather than the actual conduct of having slaves, the actual, trade of them rather than collecting them, which the Europeans never did. The Europeans would purchase slaves, contrary to the popular belief that they were skulking about villages and pilfering people in the night. No, that was the Africans themselves, as a result of tribal wars. Anyhow, one cannot even fathom how they would calculate this amount, based on the fact that it seems to be completely nebulous what it's even calculated on, because there was no real productivity occurring within the place to begin with. That is not to say that there was not production within those countries, but generally they weren't as productive as other states. In terms of human damages, in essence, the ones that have remained within the West have very much been remunerated through social welfare, as well as their actual freedom being given. Additionally, the Europeans never had to give them their freedom. It's merely because, one, it was more efficient, and two, because it was the moral, righteous thing to do. Now, these countries can barely talk about righteousness. For instance, with Ghana, we can go here. Wow, jolly good. Let's see here. Okay, so we've got there, get self-governance, that's good. I like that, that's amenable. Right, so, would you look at that? The first, so we have the first president, right, voted in after the constitutional referendum on the 1st of July 1960, in which case they became a republic and he became president. Now the issue here is that he would not continue democracy and would proceed to become a repressive dictator, essentially creating his own slave state. See, in 1964, a constitutional amendment made Ghana a one-party state. Now, whilst that's not inherently bad, the issue is then he presents himself as both president for life of both the nation and its party. Additionally, funnily enough, this man also happens to be the first African head of state to promote Pan-Africanism, meaning he was not just content to starve his own people, but rather wished to conquer everyone else and relegate them under his boot. Now, as you can see, this is quite a flagitious man. Likewise, he was also a communist and a socialist. Need I say more? Would you look at that? He's even got his own national celebration. Wow, that's amazing. Mr. Dictator over here is the recipient of a public holiday in Ghana, still to this very day. As you see, they very much retain their more tribalistic sort of power structures. As you see here, thankfully, the government was overthrown. Very good on the behalf of the army to do such a thing. Of course, then would you look at that? Okay, so they then proceed to form their own government, and then we have a series of a multitude of different governments, with an eventual military dictatorship with zero political parties. As well, the economy also crashed, as, is concomitant usually to these things. And then finally, they got their democracy back. Well done. Took a while. Oh, lovely. They also had a tribal war. Still at it, I see. Very good. And then finally, we have it that they finally have a legitimate democracy, which actually works. Very good on their behalf. Quite happy about that. That's good for them. Jolly good. It's quite amenable that they have become a greater country. After all countries ought to succeed, not just, the ones that I belong to. All peoples deserve the right to prevail. Anyhow, so that as you can see, they aren't exactly, the best of countries. Anyhow, where were we? This resistance has not deterred the country that has become the leading voice on reparations, Ghana. Wow, the country that sold the slaves in the first place after collecting them through hostile action, then proceeds to beseech the world for more money. Some things really never change, do they? Utter grifters. Oh, here we are, Foreign Minister. Ghana cannot afford to be silent on ensuring that we hold the perpetrators accountable. Talk about being hoist on your own petard here. This man is really impugning upon others when his own people were the ones who did it. Wow. Hypocrisy at its finest. Okay, right. So they were the ones that did it. Ghana was the one who tabled the UN resolution and promulgated it. And they desire reparations. Well. Not to, ensure that slavery doesn't occur in the future, such as establishing mutual defense pacts or policing actions. No, just give us money. Infinity welfare to the infinity third worlders. Of course, this would actually be quite deleterious for their own economies, because if they suddenly get a bunch of capital which has no strings tied to it, so for example, not a loan, essentially just free money for no reason, essentially what's going to happen is that the corrupt bureaucracy is going to absorb it like a sponge and squander it on whatever they may whim. This is why these countries are poor in the first place. Notwithstanding the French colonies, who unfortunately were beset by the fact that their overlords had taken everything with them when they left. But with Ghana here, this was a British colony. Therefore, they actually had quite a good affair. In fact, they got their independence decently quickly, as previously displayed. Ghana has always been a Pan-African leader. We're the first country to attain independence in sub-Saharan Africa, and to prove that it is possible to fight imperial might and win. Wow, I don't think I'd call that fighting when you got your independence given to you, rather than, going to war for it, which I'm not going to complain about. I think that's the correct way to go about it. However, you then can't proceed to turn around and besmirch the one who gave you your independence, and formed you into a coherent state in the first place. Ghana has been given special responsibility by the African Union to be its champion for reparatory justice, and it is clearly a role the country's political leadership is taking seriously. Once again, Africa being quite nepotistic. Unfortunately, this is quite the case. Essentially, they will give whatever they wish to whichever country is able to schmooze their way up to the top. This sort of venality is not very healthy. In part, that is because about 10 to 15% of the estimated 12 million Africans who were forcibly removed from their homes, by whom I may ask, torn from their villages, and dehumanized on a scale never before seen, were from what is now Ghana. Even more was shipped from its shores. I wonder where they got the slaves from. Oh wait, Ghana. Really principled here, guys. Ghana was the crime scene where these atrocities took place, so Ghana cannot afford to be silent on ensuring that we hold perpetrators accountable. Ablakwa says, yes, and those perpetrators are you. Your nation were the ones who did this. They sold people into slavery. Europeans never actually conquered... they never actually pilfered people in the night, like they're trying to describe, with forcibly removed from their homes and torn from their villages. Such vociferous language does not behoove their point here, because it merely adds to the irony of what they're saying, in that they were the ones who trafficked people through tribal wars and then sold them to the Europeans for profit. Traitors to their own people, for mere knickknacks. The minister has called for a system of reparatory justice that funds educational grants, venture capital for young African entrepreneurs, and research into enduring health issues that some argue may trace their roots back to the severe malnutrition and inhumane conditions of enslavement. Really, slavery ended. Let's see here. It was in 36 they signed the bill ending slavery, and then that came into full effect by 1842, with all slaves released. Now, I know that they happened to return a lot of slaves to Sierra Leone, hence on their flag the lines protected by Britain. But with this, there's a sophistry at its finest, because in no way would this have contributed to health issues, except for slavery within their own country, and even then, by this point, such genetic aberrances should have been bred out by now. Their severe malnutrition is a product of their living standards. And yes, whilst inhumane conditions result in stress, and stress results in, inferior progeny, the issue there is that by this point, it's been hundreds of years, well, just about 200 years, 180-ish, since slavery. What are they on about here? No, he insists is not about direct financial gain for African leaders. One of the demands laid out at the recent summit on reparations clearly talked to debt relief and debt cancellation. Now, whilst this is a bit more amenable than, say, just giving free money to the third world, this is still, nevertheless, holding essentially Europe hostage to its own sickness at the current moment. The fact that it can't stand up for itself and there's no backbone. Really, what should be happening is that they're given low-interest loans, because that will allow them to build up their economy, and that benefits all mankind vis-a-vis a greater amount of wealth in the system, which we can then trade between each other. But then the issue here is that giving free money doesn't help. It's the classic welfare paradox. You give more money to someone, they never end up developing independence. They just end up dependent, relegated to your hand, the one which feeds. Likewise, I believe there needs to be something done to remedy any sort of malnutrition or, genetic sort of trauma, right? But then the issue is, this would not just relate back to European enslavement, and this should not be seen as a necessity, but rather as a charity. By no means would Europe be indebted to do this more than the other Africans who inhabit the area. Likewise, the general corruption within these countries would result in most of this money going to the leaders themselves. Oh, would you look at that? The heretic archbishop here. Yeah, look, the Church of England hasn't exactly been the most reliable, has it now? I mean, I myself was baptized Anglican, but ugh. He also wants individual institutions that benefit from the slave trade to be held accountable and pay compensation. Among these is the Church of England. I do not see how they happen to actually benefit from... Okay, to be fair, this is a fair point. In the 18th century, the Church's missionary ring ran plantations and owned hundreds of slaves, which helped fund its work across the Americas and beyond. Okay, I would say that this actually has something that is valid to complain about. The Church having have done such a thing. But then the thing is, back then, hitherto the current socialism within modern governments, the welfare statism essentially, this was never really an issue because the church had actually used most of their funds, besides, the odd bit of corruption, which is an actual issue and should have been addressed, and I believe, if it is still around, should be addressed. Most of that money actually went to charity, which would have benefited the people in the British colonies, along with across the world. This is such folly to make this argument, because then in this case, the government should have to pay me reparations because of taxes that I've paid, because they were done forcefully. Which, to be fair, from a libertarian perspective, yes, the government is actually illegitimate in taking taxes, except if you've actually used their services, but then you don't get a choice to opt out of such services. The government will nevertheless impinge upon your rights if you don't pay them. Essentially, it's racketeering in a way. Anyhow, notwithstanding that tangent, many Church of England clergy independently own slaves. Okay, that's quite repugnant. And a recent report by the Church's Endowment Fund reported the institution made large investments in the slave trade, from which it made huge sums of money. Yes, just as the local tribal leaders. Whilst I say this, I'm not trying to at all diminish what the Church did. This is absolutely abhorrent and repugnant and noisome to the greatest degree. The only issue is, pretty much the entire society of the world was doing this. Rome had 2/3 of their population slaves, and then the rest of the world was feudal or had some other system. Therein, the entire world ran off slavery, essentially. In no way is this unique to Europe. If anything, Europe's unique in that it expunged the trade, and forced everyone else to get rid of it as well. One of these days we're going to see African leaders bemoaning the fact that slavery was even abolished in the first place, because it's a colonial holdover, or imprecation upon their dignity as a culture. That's beside the point anyway. July, the leader of the church, the archbishop, visit Ghana. Okay, sure, whatever. Okay, now this is obviously abhorrent. The fact that there were British trading posts, selling people. But then, every country was doing it, and that's not to say, they weren't culpable at all. But I would say what Britain did in using their own navy to police the world's oceans to stop slavery should equate to their extrication from this guilt, because they have, in essence, paid their reparations and made amends, and have served as a bulwark against human cruelty henceforth. Well, not so much anymore, but back then they did. Looking further, let's see. Okay, well, I mean, that's a fair question, I will say. How can the church have sat above the horrors that were going on below? Yeah, complacency wasn't very good. Okay, no, that's actually quite amenable. The church has set up £100 million, which is 135 million USD, social impact fund designed to benefit communities for to continue to feel the enduring legacy of the slave trade today. I mean, I don't know how they can still feel the legacy unless they're, like, you know, most of their village were pilfered, but yeah, no, that's good. More, you know, mutual aid societies are better. The church essentially is just one big one. Okay, I don't really see the point there. I mean, to be fair, with how poor and indigent Britain is as of current, it would be more, shall we say, befitting if they were actually to spend that money internally and, you know, help their parish communities, but whatever. Yeah, here we are. That's a fair point. One of the key counter-arguments centers on the fact that some Africans were themselves complicit in the capture and sale of their fellow people. However, this guy, the foreign minister, once again happens to we call it not care for actual history, but rather his ideological dogma. I think that there's a strategy to divide and conquer and to create a very contrived confusion, he argues. Really, there is nothing confusing here. It's merely what his ancestors were culpable. Now, he shouldn't be culpable himself, but he should be culpable for, you know, being fallacious. But notwithstanding that, he actually holds no culpability. Neither do the Britons. Neither does any people, unless they actually continue to commit such atrocities to this day. Generational guilt cannot be a thing. And if it is a thing, then in that case, pretty much all genocides are rendered legal at that point, because then it's essentially one group exacting revenge on another. Interesting. He brings up chattel slavery. Now, this happens to derive from the word cattle. I believe in French, maybe? Anyhow, yeah, the point is, though, the local actors were the ones who actually gave them slaves. And secondly, while chattel was absolutely repugnant, it actually traces its history back to the Middle East, who actually brought it over to Europe through the Spanish colonies. The point is that they had colonized the Spanish, introduced this improved version, well, I say improved, but, you know, it's a, you know, worse, but more overall efficient system of slavery over to Spain, who then export it worldwide. I don't see how this is Europe's fault when it was brought in by a foreign conqueror. Like, yes, it's terrible that they did it, but then in terms of the actual origin, there wasn't an African at the table when all these laws, insurance policies, and financial architectures were being drafted, because they were European systems, much as every area had their own system pertaining to slavery. In no capacity did the Europeans impose chattel on anyone else, neither did the Africans impose their version of slavery on the Europeans. It's merely everyone had their own slavery. We denounce and totally reject these claims that Africans are as guilty and complicit as those who masterminded this whole atrocity. Really? Really, huh? The ones who masterminded it, would that not be the ones who were actually taking the slaves and then had to find somewhere to sell them? And then, you know, Mr. White Man arrives and then you proceed to peddle them to him. Oh. Okay, now this is good. I actually think this is quite great. King Taki Teko Tusulu II, the Gamansi leader of the Gar people, recently took the step of publicly apologizing for his ancestors' involvement in the slave trade. Very good. More credit to this man. His outfit's a bit odd, but I mean, you know, more power to him. I like the cultural attire. I think that the transatlantic slave trade was the greatest crime against humanity, and my ancestors also took part as players of the trade, says the king. Good to see that he's taking responsibility. I like that. The Gar people became middlemen who traded with Europeans. They sold gold and ivory, and ultimately enslaved Africans, often those captured in local conflicts. Looks like a bit of a slip in the BBC's messaging here. In exchange for the manufactured goods brought mainly by the British and Dutch, including textiles, alcohol, and guns. No, there was no actual mention of the Dutch hitherto this point. But the king felt he needed to say sorry, not just for his own people's complicity, but for the complicity of other Africans too. Once again, more power to this guy. I like this. I stand on the same point of apologising on behalf of all traditional authorities and my ancestors and forebearers for the part they also played in the slavery of our brothers and sisters. It has affected lives and societies up to now, and to be able to go forward, you have to look at your past. It dawns on us to admit our fault and correct it, he says. Good on him. The king believes strongly in the need for those who benefited from the slave trade to pay reparations and acknowledges that he too needs to commit to making financial amends. I believe that it underpins a state of moral courage and credibility. Once again, good on him. The one thing is that the Europeans, in essence, didn't actually really benefit too much. You have individual slave owners, but then the issue is, once again, ancestral guilt. I wouldn't exactly say that the king has to give his wealth up unless he chooses to. Of course, if he's making this point, then he should probably have to pay reparations as well. If he does that, that's yet to be seen. But if he does, you know, good on him for practicing what he preaches, so to say. Okay, here's the issue. It does not dilute the guilt of European empires, rather it solidifies Africa's moral standing and sets an example as to how to move forward. So essentially his whole confessional here was merely a way to further impugn upon the Europeans. Because in essence this happens to show that, oh, Africa is better than Europe because they're more moral, despite the fact it was the Europeans who had to force them to stop doing slavery. Oh, then this is good. The country has run a high-profile campaign inviting the African diaspora, particularly African Americans, to visit the continent. Now, this is good. I think it's always a good thing for the diaspora to visit their own people. It's good. It has been promoted as a means of bringing people together in a shared story of their traumatic past, with reparations quite literally focusing on repair at a very human level. See, therein lies the matter. In the United States of America, the African Americans are to be defined on two levels. You have firstly the slavery issue, and secondly the segregation issue. Now, segregation, I could say yes, that still has an effect on people because it's a latterly occurrence. However, the issue with slavery is that was approximately 140 years ago. I see not the reason why that would affect them at all, especially since they have lived in a wealthier country. Initially, the gathering of black people from across the globe was, he felt, a beautiful, profound experience, devoid of capitalist motives. Well, well, well.
Oh, well, well, well. Well, well, well. Well, well, well.
But he says in some aspects the initiative soon morphed. Huh, interesting that. So you guys hate capitalism, and yet, let's see here. Firstly, you want money, which is completely antithetical to communism, or socialism in any regard. But secondly, we come to the point at which we arrive upon debt relief. Okay, financial compensation. Yes, we arrive at the point of venture capital. Well, hey. I don't know, this seems to kind of contravene their statement about capitalism bad. Of course now, as with all African initiatives, besides those in some of the more successful countries like Botswana per se, the Ghana Tourism Authority also latched onto it and then used it to enhance their tourism project. And now it has become more about hitting tourism quotas. Now local people are finding that they cannot afford basic things. Who would have thought moving in a wealthier population, who have deviated enough as to where they're not really your own anymore, would just result in alienation for the locals and further issues to cost of living. And then we have the other issue of the fact that they happen to be turning it into a capitalist motive. Now, capitalism is marvelous, but if you're lamenting the fact that capitalism has been some historical scourge on your people, well, it seems a bit hypocritical, no? He also questions, in an initiative that was partly supposed to be about addressing the trauma of Africans in the diaspora, why they were required to pay entrance fees at the same rates as European tourists, at, for example, the coastal castles where slaves were trafficked. Well, it's because it's not about actually healing, because there is no healing to be done. It's merely about extracting as much wealth from as many people as possible, even supposedly their own kin, their ilk, so to say. Says all of this means a missed opportunity to address deep-rooted trauma, some of which he feels is etched into the very geography and psychology of modern Ghana. Yeah, because you're the ones who sold people. Go to Jamestown and Accra, people are huddled together because there is the fear of, if I live far away, I could be taken, Sarade says, pointing to how centuries-old concerns dictated why people built their houses so close together. Now that is quite a sad fact if it is true, but then that's more of a cultural thing. It's a cultural trauma, rather than being an individual trauma. And a cultural trauma cannot be healed, except just naturally over time. So in essence, the idea that giving unlimited welfare to them would fix this problem is completely erroneous. Jamestown is one of the oldest districts in the city, a community originally built around a British coastal fort, where slaves were brought, traded, and then sent on ships to the Americas. For Sare, true reparatory justice must prioritize human connection and healing over financial transactions. Which is a fair point, but then the issue is, this is not reparatory justice because there is no justice to be dispensed. The issue has already been resolved, therefore we're just digging out old wounds. This is like for, say, the Britons lodging a case against the Italians for historical slavery by the Romans and the genocide of the Gauls, with 1/3 slain and 1/3 enslaved, leaving only 1/3 free and alive. The issue is, this is literally, in its entirety, historical revisionism. They're attempting to expunge the record of African involvement in the slave trade as the main perpetrator, rather than merely someone who benefited off the injustice that was occurring, which, by the way, I can say is no better than actually being a perpetrator. For any trade of slaves should be illegal because, in essence, the person was captured illegally, and trading captives should not be permitted because they, in their natural rights, cannot be the property of another. The one exception, of course, penal labour, but that's beside the point. Sari says about what he sees as real reparations and how we can dress it and nurse it and heal. Now, as you know, as usual, the BBC is pretty much just communist propaganda. The entire thing is just socialist drivel, really. I mean, this is just the cherry on top of the proverbial shit sundae, pardon my language. Truly, the fact that the BBC of all outlets is pushing this anti-British propaganda is repugnant and the most odious thing I've yet seen. This is by far the worst article I've seen likewise. Anyhow, thank you for watching. If you have any feedback or wish to rectify any mistakes I may have made, please do so in the comments. I'll try and respond if I can. Notwithstanding that, thank you and farewell.